All right. Well, if everybody's ready to get started, then I am going to tell our attendees a little bit about who we are. My name is Andrea Casalonis. I am the Adult Services Librarian at Falmouth Memorial Library, and we were invited to partner on the Sustainability Series by Ashley Krulik, who is the Town of Falmouth Sustainability Coordinator. Also on the panel tonight, we have Mike Doan. He's a staff scientist with Friends of Casco Bay. And our speaker this evening is Curtis Bohlen, and he is Director of the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. We may have a few other panelists pop in tonight and we'll introduce them as they come. But I'd love to tell you a little bit about Curtis and what we'll be speaking about tonight. So Dr. Curtis Bohlen, as I mentioned, is Director of the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. He is an aquatic and wetland ecologist and conservation leader with an interdisciplinary background in ecology, economics, and public policy. At the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, he works with partners with both inside and outside university organizations to seek creative solutions to environmental challenges, support local communities, and improve the management of Casco Bay. So what we'll be speaking about tonight is called The State of Casco Bay, and it is in its 6th edition. So every 5 years, the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership takes a step back and takes a close look at the current condition of Casco Bay. This is a scientific assessment of the health of the bay, and it uses the best available data and includes information on stressors, changes over time, the drivers of those changes, and what all of that data means for anyone who works, lives, or plays anywhere near Casco Bay. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, everyone. And without further ado, we will let Dr. Bohlen take over.
Andrea, thank you. I want to bottle what you just said and use it again, because I'm really excited to be able to talk about all of the State of the Bay report work we've done and all the information we've gathered. But thank you. That was a great intro and lays out things very, very well. Let me start my screen share so people can see what we're talking about. And I've got a bunch of slides to go through, but I want everybody to realize that there's really not much point in going through so many slides all at once. So I'm going to try to stop at a couple of locations in the middle of the talk to invite give and take, so we have a little bit more back and forth. And I'm hoping that Mike can jump in and help at some of those locations. But in general, if you have things that you want to get attention, speak up. We'll try to respond as quickly as we can, because if I just talk for half an hour, 40 minutes without you guys interrupting me, we'll all get bored. So let's have some fun. What I'm going to be talking about today is our Casco Bay report. And I'm looking at that first slide, and look at that. I have a typo on my very first slide. And how did I do that? Let's zip past it and ignore it. I want to start by giving you a little bit of sense of background of who we are as the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. We are one of 28 national estuary programs around the country. We are all similar organizations that are part of a national program run by the Environmental Protection Agency. We are all watershed focused, science-based. We have no regulatory role, and we all work to be collaborators with folks in our communities on work protecting the bodies of water we care about, in our case, Casco Bay. We, the Casco Bay Partnership, are led by a 24-member advisory board we call the Management Committee, and that consists of people who work with state agencies, folks at town offices, people from nonprofit organizations, including Friends of Casco Bay, and a variety of other organizations that are involved in one way or another with work on behalf of Casco Bay. We are charged by the statute that created the National Estuary Programs. We are charged with implementing a locally developed plan, which we call the Casco Bay Plans, developed by us in association with all of our partners, to sort of set priorities for a 5 or 6 year period at a time for things that we should be doing on behalf of Casco Bay. Institutionally, the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership is a small team of 4 of us. We're all hosted by the University of Southern Maine's Cutler Institute and the Wishcamper Center over on the Portland campus of USM. And we try to work in a couple of different ways. we're at base, we try to be a credible source of data and information, not only about Casco Bay, but also about what's going on around the region. What kinds of activities are going on that will benefit the Bay or that might help other people who are working on behalf of the Bay understand the community in which they live. We work hard to facilitate communications among all those groups we work with, to build consensus around priorities, to try to identify those priorities. And really, we do a lot of work providing assistance to local communities and to other organizations in helping them do their work on behalf of Casco Bay. I'll point out, we are not an advocacy organization. That's not our role. We are a group that tries to make everybody work a little smarter and work a little better together, rather than a group that pushes particular policy outcomes. We work on behalf of Casco Bay, and Casco Bay is, I'm sure there are many of you on the call who know the Bay better than I do, but it is a big, complex body of water. And it's about 160 square miles. The outer boundary, of course, is pretty poorly defined, so give or take a few 20s of miles, square miles. But it's got 575 miles of shoreline, about half of that in Harpswell alone. There's over 700 islands, islets, and ledges. Very, very complicated bathymetry underneath all those rocks and ledges. We've got 13 coastal towns that touch the border of Casco Bay. So there's a tremendous amount of complexity, both politically and hydrodynamically and physically in Casco Bay that we need to deal with. When I think about the Bay, I think of it as a tidally dominated estuary. We probably mostly talk about it as the Bay, and we think that's ocean. But in fact, we've got a lot of fresh water coming in here, and an estuary is any place where fresh and salt water mix. And we've got a couple of major sources of fresh water. The first, of course, is the Presumpscot River, which drains about 2/3 of the Casco Bay watershed, just under 2/3 of the Casco Bay watershed. The second is the Royal River, which drains about 1/3. But people forget there's about 31 other smaller tributaries around the margins of Casco Bay. And the Kennebec River, although it doesn't drain into Casco Bay, dumps a lot of fresh water into the Gulf of Maine just outside of Casco Bay. And when the wind is from the right direction, that fresh water gets swept into the Eastern Bay. So the Kennebec River is in some sense a tributary to Casco Bay as well. The watershed, I said we are watershed focused. Our watershed is just under 1,000 square miles. The northern tip is up there in Bethel. It touches 48 municipalities. And it is in many ways an economic driver for a lot of the state of Maine. It's about 4.5% of the land area of the state of Maine. That watershed contains on the order of 1/4 of the population, about 32% of all jobs, and almost 40% of the state's total economic output occurs within that watershed. So this is a really important economic, social, political, and demographic driver for the whole state of Maine. The marine economy of this region, we commissioned a study back in 2016 looking at the size and scope of the marine economy. And it's about $704 million a year based on 2016 data. And that's about 4% of the total economic output of that entire watershed is directly related to the ocean. Of that, about 3/4, a little under 3/4 is directly related to tourism. So when we think about marine industries, we might think about boats, or we might think about lobsters, but actually tourism is a larger economic driver of marine related economy than either of those are. What I'm going to do is dive into bits of the State of the Bay report, one bit at a time. And I wanted to give you a sense of what's involved in the report. I will really only be touching about 1/3 of the topics we addressed in the State of the Bay report. There were 19 chapters in State of the Bay. We looked at more than 40 data sources in order to pull it together. We actually looked originally at over 100, but boiled it down to about 40 that were available at Casco Bay scale in ways we can interpret well. And they're divided roughly 1/3 into talking about things that are upstream of the Bay that influence what's going on in the Bay, about 1/3 looking at what's happening in the Bay, and about 1/3 looking at how we as people connect to the Bay. And those 3 sections reflect different ways that we interact with the Bay and think about it in terms of policy development. The bottom line of what I'm going to talk about is as follows. The first is conditions in Casco Bay as a whole, and I will focus in on Falmouth in this later section of this, so you get to see this with a sort of a spin towards Falmouth as well. Conditions in Casco Bay are better than in most large estuaries in the US Northeast. And that really reflects two different phenomena. One is that our watershed is still largely forested, and the other is that Maine's large tides do a lot to help protect water quality. Those themes will come back over and over in a couple of different ways as I go on with this talk. The other thing I want to highlight that I think comes out of our review of State of the Bay information this time around is that a variety of ways that we as society invest in clean water, they really matter. And we're seeing the results of some of those investments and some of the policy choices we made in the past turn up in the Bay. And it's kind of neat to see that we can actually demonstrate that when you make a policy decision on land, it turns up in Casco Bay a decade later. And then last, we are in an unprecedented period of coastal change, and we largely don't know what that means in terms of the details of what's going to happen in Casco Bay. So much of what we need to be thinking about is looking forward for the uncertainties of the future and what we might want to do with it. Since my last point on the last slide was talking about coastal change, I'm going to dive in with looking at climate change very briefly. We looked at the data from the Portland Jetport. Portland Jetport has had a weather monitoring station in more or less the same location since the 1940s. So we've got about an 80-year record of consistent data collection from one location, which is pretty neat. It's a pretty nice record to be able to look at. And a couple of things jumped out very quickly. Yes, it's getting warmer out there. Summertime annual temperatures have gone up about 1/3 of a degree Fahrenheit per decade. So on the order of 80 years, it's gone up, 3 or 4 degrees. Winter low temperatures have gone up much faster. They've gone up about 10 degrees over that same period of time. So your lowest low temperature of the winter might have been -20 back there in the 1940s, and it's more likely to be -10 today. So, big changes in terms of winter minimum temperatures, and those have big effects on the biota of organisms living in the Bay because cold conditions are often controlling what can survive in Casco Bay. We also have many, many fewer cold days, the lower left-hand panel here. Both days below freezing have dropped. They've dropped by about 20, 23 days per year over the last 80 years. And days below zero have gone from maybe 20 a year to about 5 or 6 a year over that same period. So those really cold days are getting much less common. And for any of you who are gardeners, one of the things that I pulled out of looking at this is how long the growing season is. Number of days between the last spring frost and the first fall frost. And that growing season has gone up by about a month over the last 80 years. So things are changing according to the Portland Jetport weather, and I think we can see similar things elsewhere. And any of you who are winter sports enthusiasts know how much harder it is to find good snow near the coast now than it was when I was a kid. We can see similar trends occurring in Casco Bay itself, and this is data from Friends of Casco Bay, where they've been collecting data from a series of locations for almost 30 years now, looking at temperature among many other water quality parameters. And there's a strong trend of upward of about 2 degrees centigrade over the last 25 years or so in Casco Bay. So there's been a big change in temperature in the Bay. And this is mostly looking at summer months. Winter months, the Friends of Casco Bay does not have as robust a data set. They're smart enough not to be out there all that often when it's freezing cold. It's not just temperature. Climate change is also affecting what we see for rainfall. The average rainfall at the Portland Jetport has gone up by about 10 degrees per year on average. There's a lot of scatter around that number. So, it doesn't mean any one year is wet or any one year is dry, but on average, we're seeing wetter years and fewer drier years. And the other change that's happening is that more and more of that precipitation is coming in large, heavy storm events. So we have this weird paradoxical situation where we both have an increased risk of flooding and an increased risk of drought. And that's affecting a variety of other things in terms of river flow dynamics, stream flow dynamics, and the ecology of coastal waters because of changes in salinity. All those changes in climate have some interesting consequences in terms of the biology of Casco Bay. And I grabbed this one because I totally love this slide. This is a picture of a kelp blade collected late in the summer. I think this was off on Peaks Island, but I'm actually not sure where this one was collected. And it's showing a lot of the non-native invasives, many of which would not persist and would not be as abundant if we had colder waters in the winter. So just for those who are bears for punishment on invasive species, the orange blobs are a non-native tunicate that is quite widespread in Casco Bay. You'll see it mostly in the late summer because it dies off over the winter and then comes back in the spring. The little blobby gray and silver areas are another tunicate that is similar timing in terms of when it grows. And the little bushy things are bushy bryozoans, probably non-native, but it's a little hard to tell from the photograph. And there's an encrusting bryozoan called membranipara, which is commonly growing on kelp blades. So the point is that probably half of the biomass of things growing on this kelp blade are not native species. And that's fairly common on docks and piers around Casco Bay, that you'll see a lot of these non-native species growing on there. It's not cause and effect with climate change, but it's a stressor that is made worse with climate change. Let's pause there and see, is any back and forthing? Anybody want to chime in on anything on that? And Andrea, I don't know if you can help manage any questions that have come up.
Yep, I'd be happy to. If anybody wants to chime in at any point, feel free. We don't have anything in the chat or Q&A at this point, but if there's anything at any point in the presentation that you have a question about, feel free to type that right in or to click that raise hand button, folks.
Okay, so I keep steaming ahead then?
I think so, yep, and I'll keep monitoring that and I'll let you know when they pop up.
Great, thank you. So another theme I wanted to touch on is land use and its effect on water quality and on what's going on in our region. And so one of the things we did in State of the Bay is what I think of as we stand in Casco Bay, turn and look uphill, what do you see? About 60% of the Casco Bay watershed is in forest land. About 13% is developed land, about 6% in agriculture, 9% various kinds of, I say other wetland because it's not just forested wetland, it's all the other kinds of wetlands, and a 9% open water like lakes and ponds and rivers. So this is actually, compared to many of the other estuaries in the northeastern United States, we have a lot of forest. And this has a lot to do with protecting water quality. Both forests tend to absorb nutrients rather than release nutrients. They tend to trap sediment rather than release sediment. Many pollutants are not generated much by forested landscapes. And so this kind of land use upstream is a big part of why Casco Bay's water quality is in pretty good shape. Of course, there's a huge difference between our upper watershed, which is much more forested, and our lower watershed, which is much more suburban. The protection of that forest land and therefore of land use in Casco Bay watershed is actually one of the bigger achievements of land conservation in the region over the last 20 years or so, has been this steady increase in protected land in the Casco Bay watershed. Much of this is in the upper watershed, some of it is in Falmouth. The total area of protected land in the watershed is now up to just above 14% of the Casco Bay watershed as a whole. That's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. I will also flag that there is now a national goal for protecting 30% of land area and water areas of the United States by 2030. I think that's a very ambitious goal for us to think about in the Casco Bay watershed. But if you're protecting water quality, you're protecting upland forests, you're protecting wetlands, that's reducing runoff of potentially damaging pollutants to Casco Bay. So these are not unrelated issues. We can look a little more closely and look town by town in the coastal towns and look at where land has been protected and where less land has been protected. Falmouth jumps out actually as having a relatively high proportion of the town in permanently protected status. This reflects the work of several land trusts, the Presumpscot Regional Land Trust, but also your own open space office. This has been a long time coming, and the town should be very proud of the accomplishments involved here. Not an easy thing to do, and I think has profound implications both for community recreation opportunities and for water quality. Overall, in this lower region of the Casco Bay, though, over the last couple of decades, there was a significant decline in the rate of land protection. And we're not entirely sure why that is. It may have a lot to do with both federal and state funding priorities, where land conservation was not considered a priority for a while. That may be changing under a variety of different kinds of political leadership, but we don't really know how much of that is caused by politics and how much is by the rapidly increasing costs of land conservation in these coastal communities. All that land conservation is directly related back to water quality. So what we did as part of the State of the Bay is we looked at Maine biomonitoring data. Maine's Department of Environmental Protection goes out and actually puts what they call a rock basket. It's literally a basket filled with rocks, and they put it in a stream and leave it there for a month. They go back out and collect that basket of rocks, and they scrape all the insects and other organisms living on the rocks and identify everything. And they can look at all the organisms that are living in the stream and get some idea of whether that stream is healthy or not. So this is used as an indicator of water quality. We did in our State of the Bay report, we related the health of those streams directly back to how much asphalt is in the sub-watershed where those samples were collected. And if you look at the map on the right-hand side, the darker the red blobs, the lower the water quality according to these stream invertebrates. And if you look at the gray backgrounds, the darker the gray, the more asphalt is in the sub-watershed where they're found. And what you'll see is all the light white areas in the upper watershed have water quality where the insects are consistent with a Class A stream water quality standard. And as you move down lower into the lower part of the watershed, you move into areas where there's more and more asphalt, you end up with poorer and poorer stream insect communities. So there is a direct connection between urbanization and stream water quality. And there's only a handful of samples in Falmouth, and they're mostly in areas with intermediate to fairly high levels of impervious cover, as we call the counting up the asphalt in the watershed. And they all have moderately poor water quality. So these are all related themes, and they're serious problems for our urban areas close to the Casco Bay shoreline. This is such a common pattern that there's actually a scientific literature around this idea of the urban stream syndrome, where there's all sorts of things that happen as you urbanize the watershed around a stream. You start to see more and more flooding, and more flooding means more and more erosion, and more erosion means you destroy habitat quality. But in Maine, the other thing you see is you have more and more asphalt, you have more and more winter salt put down on the stream. And that salt starts to be toxic to the stream organisms. And then you also have road runoff, which can contain a variety of toxic chemicals and bacteria from being washed off of adjacent areas with heavy human use or use by domestic animals. So there's a lot of things that happen in parallel as you urbanize a watershed. It's not just that you have a lot of asphalt, it's that the entire change of a watershed to more and more urban makes it harder and harder for a stream to be healthy.
So we did have a question come in.
Okay, yep.
Richard
is one of my breaks.
Yep, and so Richard is wondering, has this study ever included Suckfish Brook, which drains Highland Lake? The stream invertebrate samples, I would have to look at the map in detail. I don't actually know whether there's one. What drains Highland Lake, though, is not Suckfish. It's not called that down there. It's Mill Brook, isn't it? I may be getting confused but Suckfish is going into Highland Lake, isn't it? I'm a little confused here because I don't live there.
I think that's correct. Yeah, I think Suckfish
okay.
and Mill Creek.
And Maine's Department of Environmental Protection does these samples, and they go around the state roughly every 5 years. I pulled up data from the last decade, so the last 2 rounds of sampling for that map. So I would have to go and dive into my details to see for sure whether there's one there or not. I would actually be a little surprised if nobody's ever looked at either of those, because Highland Lake is such a high visibility site, and there's been so much concern about water quality in Highland Lake itself. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer off the top of my head.
Richard did say that is correct about Millbrook, and Susan chimed in as well.
Okay.
Millbrook runs out of Highland Lake.
Okay, yeah. Typical name confusion. I can probably try to figure that out. I just don't have it right in front of me. I wanted to then move a little bit from thinking about land use. I wanted to move towards a couple of places where I think we've been seeing some very good news when we put together the State of the Bay report. And much of this reflects really concerted efforts on the part of our municipalities to do better on water quality. And I think it's important for us to remember that there's nobody as important for water quality in Casco Bay as the municipal employees who work on clean water. And for that, I'm thinking of the folks who run the wastewater treatment facilities. I'm thinking of the people who do stormwater management. I'm thinking of the folks at Portland Water District who are dealing with combined sewer overflows. There's just a tremendous amount of work going on behind the scenes that most people are unaware of at the municipal level that really is where the heaviest lifting for protecting water quality occurs. And these people don't get enough thanks. And I want to really point to the amount of investment that our communities are making in clean water and the really important work that is going on at the community level to do this. So one of the things I wanted to pull out is this factoid we came up with, this analysis we did of total discharges from combined sewer overflows. And this is one of those weird historical things that people don't always realize. We built a lot of our sewers before we had wastewater treatment plants. And so where did they go? They went to the open water. And what happened is when we built wastewater treatment facilities, we, generally speaking, just use the existing sewer lines. And when it rains hard enough, those systems have a tendency to overflow. In the Casco Bay region, there are now 4 towns that still have places where that happens. Those are Cape Elizabeth, Portland, South Portland, and Westbrook. Yarmouth used to have some, but they got rid of them about a decade ago. And I'm not sure, Falmouth, I don't think has ever been permitted for them. So I don't know what the situation is in Falmouth, but I don't think it's ever been a CSO town. But over the last 25 years, the total volume of combined sewer overflow discharges, which are a combination of stormwater, which ain't exactly clean, and human waste in our sewer lines, has gone down on average of almost 50 million gallons per year over a 25-year period. And what that largely reflects is investments on the part of our towns in reducing combined sewer overflows. Any of you driving through Portland have seen that giant construction project next to 295. That is picking up Portland's 2 largest combined sewer overflow discharge points and putting them in a giant storage container so that when it rains, it'll fill up that storage container before it overflows into Back Cove. A very important project, very important for water quality in Back Cove and in other parts of Portland. And that's the kind of major investment that our towns have been making in order to reduce combined sewer overflows. Another example of recent investment that I think is worth highlighting is Portland Water District, which runs the East End wastewater treatment plant in Portland, updated their aeration system at the plant back in 2017. And they were very clever about it. And they did it in a way where they have more control over oxygen and lack of oxygen in various parts of the treatment train. So they're able to optimize running the plant to remove nitrogen using clever bacterial processes in the tanks, the open water tanks they've got there. And they've managed every summer since 2017 to reduce the amount of nitrogen, which in this case is a pollutant, and I'll talk more about that later. They've managed to reduce the discharge of nitrogen by nearly 75% every summer since then. It's a pretty amazing accomplishment, and it was done basically because of some very clever engineering, very clever thinking on the part of the people at the Portland Water District who manage that plant. Another success story that I want to point to is a reduction in almost all of the toxic contaminants that we can find in Casco Bay. It's not literally all of them, but most toxic contaminants that we've been studying for long enough to look at trends, and that's an important caveat, have been declining over time. And here I'm looking at what are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And basically what that means is it's the complicated molecules that are part of petroleum products and a bunch of byproducts of combustion, things like that. The primary sources in our landscape are probably related to automobiles in one way, shape, or form or another. There are other sources as well, but that's one of the biggest sources of it. And we see, again, over the last couple of decades, a significant decline in the concentration of these contaminants in all of the sites where we've got long-term data. This is looking at contaminants in blue mussels in 3 locations down in the area near Portland and Falmouth. What drives this reduction is a whole bunch of different changes. Some of it may be related to automobile tail emission standard changes. Some of it may be improved stormwater management on the part of our municipalities. Some of it may be just improved public awareness not to dump the oil into the storm drain. There's a variety of things that are driving these changes, but it's a pretty nice accomplishment to look at over many decades. A significant decline in this is happening. We can look at most other contaminants in the sediments around Casco Bay, and we can see a similar downward trend. As we do a better job of keeping contaminants out of the environment, they don't end up in Casco Bay. And that reflects what we're doing on land.
Curtis, I'm just going to chime in. Robert and Vicky have a question. Are the 15% protected lands or the goal of protecting 30% of the watershed enough to avoid long-term problems for the bay?
That's a very good question. And I have to say that it really depends on how well we manage the other lands and what's going on the other lands. Permanent protection means there is some long-term legal mechanism in place to prevent any changes to land use. Much of the upper forested watershed right now is not permanently protected, but it is likely to remain in forest for a fairly long period of time because it is in productive forestry production. So there's economic forces keeping it in that land use. As those start to convert to other uses, if they all became subdivisions, we'd have serious water quality problems. So you know, it's not a one-to-one transition. If all we were protecting was 30% of the forested area of the watershed as forest, we would have serious water quality problems. But that's not how actual changes in land use happen over time. So the goal of 30% is, in a sense, creating an anchor set of places and parcels that can provide a variety of other public services, whether that's recreation, support for forest interior species, biodiversity support, and resilience to climate change. But for Casco Bay by itself, if only we had 30% forest, I think we'd be seeing significant other water quality challenges.
And then just really quickly, a comment from Richard. He says, I'm glad you have been able to find enough blue mussels for the samples. He's seen a major decline in wild blue mussels in the bay.
There have been, and we've been in some serious conversations about why and what's been going on. It may very well be related to various kinds of predation on the blue mussels. I didn't have to hunt these down. These are actually hunted down by the staff of Maine's Department of Environmental Protection. They've been going to these same locations for years, and I had the exact same thought. Where did they find them? And can they still find the mussels in the same location? I think what I'm hearing from the people who do this work is that they have to look a little bit differently. The intertidal sites have pretty much lost all of their blue mussels. When you get a little bit deeper in the water, they're not all gone. And you can often find them hiding out in cracks where things maybe have a harder time preying on them. So it's an interesting issue. The aquaculture industry in Casco Bay still largely relies on wild planktonic larvae for blue mussels establishment. They're not growing blue mussels in a hatchery and then moving them out into the bay. They're mostly relying on wild blue mussel propagation. So there's enough blue mussels out there to produce larvae for the aquaculture industry, but just not to recreate our mussel beds. Who knows why? It's a great question.
And while we're answering some questions, Peter asks, he says, hydrocarbons and other contaminants down. Are pesticides or high nitrogen levels contaminants?
So yeah, I'll talk about both of those in a second. So really, really good question. And the answer is yes, I consider them both contaminants. And part of what I'm maybe oversimplifying in expressing things, there are a variety of contaminants that have been monitored for a very, very long time. They're largely the contaminants that people were focusing on in the 1960s and 70s. And so it's a very small subset of all the things we might consider to be important contaminants. So we have good data on DDT going back decades, but we have very, very limited data on some of the pesticides like the neonicotinoids or the pyrethroids that are much more commonly used today. So it's an interesting dynamic that the data that's available doesn't necessarily address some of the things which are probably increasing today in comparison to the data that we do have, which is largely for things that were known to be problematic several decades back, and therefore we took legal action to reduce their uses. Shall I keep going?
That's all of our questions for this moment. So I say, let's keep going.
There's my little circle to say, yeah, and this site, the lower of the three sites is Mill Creek, and it's right there in Falmouth. So there's a Falmouth location, and you can see that in Falmouth, the concentration of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons has been going down. Nutrients, you asked about nutrients. That's so great. You set me right up. One of the things that we're very concerned about for Casco Bay, and this really goes back to the leadership of Friends of Casco Bay for the last decade at least, we're really concerned about the potential for excess nutrients affecting Casco Bay. And it's a little bit of a confusing topic to introduce. Nutrients are an essential building block of living tissue, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. We're principally interested in nitrogen and phosphorus as being two potentially important nutrients in coastal areas. And if you have too many nutrients entering the bay, it leads to a whole series of water quality changes that are come under this sort of umbrella term of coastal eutrophication. And the classic problems would be low or no dissolved oxygen conditions, which could lead to fish kills or reduction of the available habitat for organisms that require oxygen. A variety of different algal blooms, things like harmful algal blooms that can be toxic, or just declines in water clarity, which can reduce people's aesthetic enjoyment of the bay, or shading from algae from phytoplankton that will kill off eelgrass beds, reducing habitat quality. But there's other things like coastal acidification is clearly related to coastal nutrient levels in a variety of complicated ways. So that's another new and emerging area of thought and emerging science. And really just things like you get a fish kill, it smells bad, and some of those algae smell bad. And all of this can lead to a variety of negative changes. When I talk about nutrients, I may not be using it in the way that people think. Ecologists use the term in a specific technical way, and they're not talking about, we talk about nutrients in our food. We usually mean vitamins, or we need it's good to eat broccoli and not potato chips. The ecological use of the term is really focusing on elements. So they're counting up the atoms of carbon or the atoms of nitrogen that are required to build a living organism. And there's this weird idea in ecosystem ecology that it doesn't matter whether you're building a moose or a crab, it takes a certain amount of carbon, a certain amount of nitrogen, a certain amount of phosphorus. And it's like baking a cake. You can make various different cakes, but you're going to need eggs, and you're going to need flour, and you're going to need butter. And sort of the same idea here. It doesn't matter what living organism you're building, you're going to need similar things, because guess what? Proteins are made with nitrogen, and your DNA is made with phosphorus. And so you can't be a living organism without having access to those elements. The nutrients of concern we're mostly concerned about in coastal water are generally nitrogen and phosphorus. There are other nutrients of concern in other settings, but we haven't focused on them much in Casco Bay. What makes this an interesting area to talk about in Casco Bay is that there are few dramatic events. And if you go to some of the other estuaries in the Northeast, they have fish kills, not on a regular basis, but often enough to really raise public visibility about these nutrient enrichment problems. In Casco Bay, we tend to have much more subtle effects, like the effects I mentioned earlier on coastal acidification. And we see episodic events like algae blooms. Not all of Casco Bay's algae blooms are likely driven by high nitrogen levels, but some of them almost certainly are. And we have some pretty significant probable effects, like why is there so little eelgrass in certain areas of the bay where nitrogen levels are high? So the cause and effect is a little hard to nail down sometimes, but in general, we're right on the edge of seeing some of these effects and therefore of concern. And of course, what makes this more of a problem is that over time, we expect many of these causes to become more serious. Let me give you an idea of what we know. One of the things we were able to do for this state of the bay is really look at where nutrients are coming from entering Casco Bay. We were able to look at the tributaries and look at, and this is from data collected by some scientists at the University of Maine, where they monitored nitrogen concentrations coming down the Presumpscot, the Royal River, and in Capissic Brook, an urban stream in Portland. And then we can also look at wastewater loads coming from all the wastewater plants, and you can see the little tiny slice of total nutrients entering Casco Bay that comes from the Falmouth plant in yellow there. And then also atmospheric deposition. And what you can see, we used to think that these were about equal, that we'd be about a third of each of these. And what we've learned is atmospheric deposition is quite a bit lower than we thought it was, which means more of the nutrient loads to Casco Bay are probably controllable in one way, shape, or form or another. But there are a variety of other sources we could not find data on. We could not find data on what the nitrogen concentration of all those combined sewer overflow flows are. Nobody monitors for concentrations of nutrients in those right now, so we're not entirely sure what the concentrations are. We don't have any data on the nitrogen in stormwater that runs off to Casco Bay without entering a stream or a river. And that's a big, big hole because the entire Portland Peninsula, all of the Falmouth Falls foreside, all of the other four sides drain pretty much directly to Casco Bay without entering a stream. And that's where most of our urban land is. So big, big problems of leaving those numbers out. And then for the Eastern Bay, we have very little data on what might be entering the bay directly from septic tanks. So the problem, of course, if those are our major sources, as population grows, we're going to have more human waste and more sewage, and that means more nutrients entering the bay. And as we urbanize more, we're going to have more stormwater, which is a source of nutrients entering the bay. And if we do more driving, or at least more driving with internal combustion engines, we will be depositing more atmospheric deposition to the bay because a primary source of nitrogen in the atmosphere is coming from automobile exhaust. Other sources we have that are in the region, agricultural production, it's only about 10% of the land area of Casco Bay's watershed, so it's not as huge as it is in many other northeastern estuaries, but it's there. Use of lawn chemicals is an area that both Falmouth and South Portland and Portland have been focusing on finding ways to reduce the influence of nutrient delivery from those sources. And as we convert land uses from forest or wetland to other more polluting land uses, we're going to increase nutrient delivery to the bay as well. So as we change what's going on the land, we will see increases in nutrient loads. So if we're close to a limit now where things are changing, those things might be of concern to us. When we look in Casco Bay itself, we can look at nitrogen levels, and what we see is nitrogen levels in Casco Bay are often above levels of concern. DEP has used for a number of years 2 different thresholds. I put the little blue arrows there to make them easier to see. The little dotted lines are a little tougher to see on the graphic. The lower threshold at 0.32 milligrams per liter of total nitrogen is used as a threshold to protect eelgrass beds. If it gets above that, eelgrass has a harder time surviving. And at 0.45 threshold is a threshold used to assess risk against low dissolved oxygen conditions occurring in the adjacent waters. And what you can see is that pretty much everywhere within the bay, they're organized by regions of the bay here. You occasionally see observations that are above those levels of concern. And in some cases, like the Royal River Estuary, most observations are above those levels of concern. We can focus in a little bit on Falmouth and point out that there's only a couple of sites on Falmouth's foreshore, and both of them have relatively low levels of nitrogen. They very seldom have high levels. They do occasionally, but very, very rarely. But the Presumpscot River, we do see levels that are between those 2 threshold levels. This is the long-term median, so half the observations are above and below that level. So in the Presumpscot River, we do see somewhat elevated levels. It might be easy to lay the blame here on pointing towards the wastewater treatment plant that's at the head of Presumpscot, but I don't think that's right. I think this has to do with hydrodynamics, and this is going to take me a little bit to explain, so bear with me here. If you imagine being able to measure water temperature and water salinity along that blue line on the map on the right, going from the head of tide at the head of Presumpscot Estuary and heading all the way out to Fort Gorges. If you could do that and take measurements every couple of inches all the way down to the bottom, you'd end up with something like the pictures on the left rather. In fact, the pictures are made by interpolating between the data collected at the places where those round circles are on the graphics. But if you look on the top right, of those two graphics. So under strongly stratified, the light blue is showing you areas that are basically fresh water, and the dark purple is showing you areas that are basically full seawater. In the springtime, with lots of water coming down the Presumpscot River, we're creating a floating mat of fresh water floating on top of seawater that goes all the way out past the Martins Point Bridge and almost out to Fort Gorges. You can see little bits of it's slightly fresher water all the way out at the surface. So the Presumpscot Estuary extends all the way out to Fort Gorges. You can also see on the May image on the left, it's a little harder to see, but the water temperatures are warmer inshore. So warmer water is lighter than colder water. Fresh water is lighter than salt water. So they both tend to float. So we end up with this interesting situation with water floating on top of the seawater coming in on the estuary. By late summer, in September, that wedge of fresh water and warm water is much shorter. It only extends out in the middle of the Presumpscot Estuary, not all the way out even really to the Martins Point Bridge. But what this does is it leads to a process that concentrates algae and other particulate matter in the middle of the Presumpscot Estuary. And it's a little hard to understand why, but we have fresh water coming downstream in that upper surface layer, and that's washing things downstream. Meanwhile, the tide is sloshing back up on the next rising tide, and it's pushing water back up. But since it's pushing mostly salt water up, it's pushing water up at the bottom of the estuary rather than the surface. So what you end up with is a circular water movement pattern in the middle of the estuary, where the water will move downstream on the surface and move upstream at depth. And this circular flow tends to concentrate materials in the middle of the estuary. And I think we're seeing that kind of dynamic in most of Casco Bay's smaller sub-estuaries. We see high nitrogen levels in the Presumpscot, but we also see it in the Royal River. We see it in the Harrisicot River in Freeport. We see it at the upper end of the Fore River. And it's these estuarine circulation dynamics that are absolutely critical to understanding where we see these challenges. But the good news is, when we look long-term historical records, summer month nitrogen levels across Casco Bay, they may be high at off and on, but they are on average declining over time. These long-term declines are statistically robust at 3 of the 5 locations that have been monitored. And of course, Clabberd Island is right in front of Falmouth. So there's a long-term decline in nitrogen occurring right there in Falmouth's waters itself, which is really interesting to figure out. We're not entirely sure why. Some of this may reflect the work that's been going on at the Portland Water District, but there's one other long-term regional trend in nutrient inputs that that reflects, again, some of the other regulatory changes we made around the nation. Throughout the Northeast, there is a long-term decline in nitrogen being deposited on the surfaces from the atmosphere. How did it get there to the first place? The atmosphere is 3/4 nitrogen, but it's not in a biologically active form of nitrogen. What we're measuring here are 2 biologically active forms of nitrogen that are detected in a monitoring location at Wolf's Neck in Freeport. These are ammonium and nitrate, and they're both available for organisms to fuel the growth of those organisms and cause also all of those water quality problems I've been talking about. And what we found looking at the Wolf's Neck data is that the total amount of nitrogen being deposited on the surface of Casco Bay from the atmosphere has probably gone down by a factor of 1/3 over the last 20 years or so. This reflects patterns that are seen throughout the Northeast, and it's thought to largely reflect better tailpipe emissions from automobiles. And I will point out again, if you're driving an internal combustion engine automobile, you're producing nitrogen that is eventually going to find its way into Casco Bay or another body of water downstream. So as we start to shift more and more towards electric vehicles, we're not only going to be having global climate change benefits, we're also going to have local water quality benefits. And then I want to focus in on Falmouth for a bit. So before I dive into that, any comments or questions at this point?
We did have one question pop up from Peter, who says, how does water temperature affect nitrogen levels?
Oh, it's a good question. It does not affect it directly in that the nitrogen levels, nitrogen is coming in from elsewhere, but it does affect what form the nitrogen is in, because nitrogen is very biologically active. As I said, you need nitrogen to build living organisms. That includes bacteria and phytoplankton. And the warmer the water is, the more likely those organisms are going to take it up fast, and they'll grow faster. And so you'll end up with more and more of the nitrogen in organic form, in living organisms, or in complicated organic molecules, and less of it in the ammonium and nitrate forms. But you're not going to create it or destroy it that way. You're just going to change what form it's in. So warmer temperatures affect what happens with the nutrients, but won't affect the total amount. The total amount is going to be affected by things like total runoff from the watershed, and these on-land processes, like how much fertilizer is being used in the watershed, how much road runoff is occurring, and how much waste we are generating as human waste we are generating as a population, and how much of that is being properly treated on shore, and how much of it is finding its way into the bay.
And
so let's look at.
We just had one pop in from Richard, who asked, am I correct to say that there are no long-lasting dead zones in Casco Bay?
There have been no long-lasting dead zones in Casco Bay. In fact, low dissolved oxygen events have been very, very rare in Casco Bay. We know of a couple of them in the upper reaches of the New Meadows up in Harpswell and Phippsburg back in the 80s. And those were caused by a huge concentration of fish up there, actually basically breathing up all their own oxygen and killing themselves off. Very, very bizarre situation. And then more recently, back in 2017, there was an algae bloom that caused some low dissolved oxygen observations in a couple of areas around the bay. A non-native new species of marine algae that had never been seen in Casco Bay before, that caused a relatively brief period of low but not zero dissolved oxygen observations. But nobody was really looking because we haven't seen them for so long. There could have been worse conditions that we just didn't notice because nobody started looking fast enough. But my sense is that they are quite rare at the moment. And part of that is the large tidal mixing. We have a lot of energy moving water around, and that helps prevent having an area of static water that loses all of its oxygen over time and stays at low dissolved oxygen levels.
Hey, Curtis,
So
I just want to do a quick time check too, that we're coming up on 7 o'clock. So just so
Okay.
you know where we're at.
Okay. Well, let me zip through quickly and sort of talk about thinking about Falmouth specific things. I want to highlight that Falmouth is a suburban community, and many of the things we see adjacent to Falmouth reflect the suburban nature of the area. And this is looking at some of the contaminants from a different perspective. Rather than looking at trends over time, we're looking at the static conditions over the last few years. And Mill Creek, right there in front of Falmouth, has got intermediate levels of most of the contaminants in blue mussels. They're not as high as they are in the more urban sites at the East End and Spring Point, and they're not as low as they are in the sites in the Eastern Bay. Similarly, we can look at pesticides. In this case, the Board of Pesticide Control looked at a bunch of pyrethroid pesticides in marine sediments around Casco Bay. The only one they detected regularly enough to analyze is one called bifenthrin. For those of you who are interested in PFAS chemicals, bifenthrin is considered a PFAS under some definitions. And we looked at how abundant it was compared to how much asphalt was nearby. And this is a map showing the sampling locations and the road surfaces near those sampling locations. And when you do a map of it, you can see that there's a very tight relationship between the local amount of asphalt near the sampling location and the concentration of bifenthrin found in those marine sediments. The two red dots are the Falmouth samples. And just like before, you're not at the worst, you're not in the most urban landscape settings, and you're not at the least urbanized, the least developed area landscapes either. And when we look more generally at water quality, we get another pattern for Falmouth where we spent a lot of time realizing that cold water tells us that it's strongly influenced by the offshore waters. Warmer waters tend to be influenced more by what's going on onshore. So we can look at summer median temperatures, and that gives us a good idea of the degree to which different locations are mixing with offshore water, which tends to have lower pollutant loads. And this graphic, the darker blues are cooler and the lighter blues are warmer. And what you see is those locations right in front of Falmouth. Oh, I thought I had a circle coming up, but I don't. The sites right in front of Falmouth are relatively cool water. they're getting a lot of offshore water mixing, and that probably helps protect water quality right in front of Falmouth. We can look at that in terms of the detailed data from Friends of Casco Bay. Looking at water, we organize these along a temperature gradient. So the cooler, more offshore water is to the left, and the warmer, more inshore water is to the right on each of these graphics. And I can circle the sites that are in Falmouth. And again, Falmouth is got a lot of that offshore water. The temperatures are relatively cool. You don't have the very high warm waters of the inland estuarine sites. There are a couple of Presumpscot River sites all the way on the right-hand side. But those Falmouth locations are pretty much where you would expect them to be. They have very clear water. They have relatively high dissolved oxygen. Salinities are fairly high, and they're generally showing what you would expect with high mixing with those offshore waters. On the other hand, when we look at something that doesn't get mixed as much with that offshore waters, which is looking at bacteria, Maine's Department of Marine Resources samples bacteria along the coast in locations where people are likely to harvest shellfish. They don't do it along the coasts of Portland and South Portland because harvesting is illegal there. And what pops up immediately looking along the Falmouth shoreline is that it's got some of the highest bacteria concentrations consistently of all the sites around Casco Bay. Again, this is your urban runoff or your suburban runoff coming off the Route 1 corridor, finding its way to the coast, and all those other developed lands right adjacent to the shoreline. There's a fair amount of bacteria finding its way into the water there, and we're seeing it pretty regularly. Most of these are still legally harvestable for most of the time, but it's just a warning sign to say, yep, urbanization, suburbanization is hard on local water quality. And I wanted to end with a little brief discussion of sea level rise, because I think it's interesting to think about what that might mean for Falmouth. The first here is to just show that in Casco Bay, sea level rise has been going up about 3/4 of an inch a decade. So about 8 inches over the nearly 100-year record that is available from the Portland tide gauge. And that's pretty much right in keeping with global averages. But the consequences of that in terms of the frequency of coastal flooding are pretty dramatic. Back in the 1920s, flood events as defined by what would be above current highest astronomical tide were occurring less than once a year on average, and now they're occurring about 8 times a year on average. What gets even scarier if we start to look forward and talk about what happens if we start to simulate sea level rise over time. And this is a very simplistic model. We've actually done some more sophisticated ones as well, but this one shows the basic concept. Let's raise the water level. We've got our fixed flood elevation and a distribution of tides. This is the highest elevation of the water on each day over a 19-year period. Let's raise the water level by 6 inches. And you see you get a few more flood events. We start to see just a few more floods. Let's raise it a little bit higher to a foot higher than what we've got now. And you see more flood events. Oh, I'm sorry, that's at 6 inches now. We've got about 16 floods per year. At 9 inches, we get about 30 floods a year. At 12 inches, we've got about 45 or 50 floods a year. And this is based on sea level rise above our current official tidal epoch, which ended 20 years ago. If we actually add in the current sea level rise that's occurred between 20 years ago and now, we're closer to this level. And we're looking at something around 60 or 65 flood events per year at 15 inches higher sea level rise than what was happening 20 years ago. So if we see 1 foot of sea level rise, we expect to see between 50 and 60 flood events annually. And these are minor flood events. It might only be a couple of inches, but for anything that's really close to sea level, this could be a major impact on our coastal infrastructure. So let me skip by the rest of that and show you a map of where are the areas that flood now under high tide events in Falmouth. Almost all of them are salt marshes. And those are luckily areas where we have relatively little built infrastructure. So there's less concern about what's going to happen there in terms of us having to manage that infrastructure. But rising tides may also have pretty significant effects on the ecological health of those tidal marshes. So that's a potential risk. When I look at Falmouth and think about likely sea level rise risks, though I think about something different. I don't just think about static flooding, I think about coastal erosion. And this is a slice of a map that the Maine Geological Survey puts together looking at bluff erosion risks along different parts of the Maine coast. And this is a combination of soil types and exposure and the wave distance that the waves can travel. And for me, as we start to think about sea level rise, erosion rates on many of these erodible bluffs may increase. And we're going to have to start thinking about how do we manage that erosion in ways that are also not harmful to surrounding shorelines and also to other marine ecosystems in the area. I think that's the end of what I had to talk about. We do have local fact sheets that focus on local information from the state of the Bay, focusing on local areas. Our Southern Bay one has been produced. It is going through its last final reviews, should be posted on our website in the next few days. And with that, I am done.
And we did have two final questions come in. So Frank asks, what would you attribute clearer water to around Falmouth?
The primary thing is probably that you've got a lot of, what's going to make the water less clear are going to be two things. One is going to be delivery of sediments. So the waters in the Royal River estuary are generally cloudy because the Royal River carries a lot of water that has been eroding the presumpscate clays and silts in the lower part of the Casco Bay watershed. And that whole body of water, therefore, is very cloudy. Down near Falmouth, the presumpscate is largely draining the upper watershed and has much, much lower sediment loads because the Sebago Lake traps a lot of sediments. So the Sebago Lake, coming out the Falmouth is relatively clear water out of the freshwater sources. So our primary source of cloudiness is going to be algae, marine algae. And if we're not seeing it, we're seeing clear water there, it's because we're getting waters probably largely being diluted by offshore waters where concentrations of those algae are lower for most of the year. And again, some of this is seasonality that we're looking at data at only certain times of year, but those offshore waters in Casco Bay tend to be clearer than onshore waters. So I think it's another way of saying Falmouth is lucky from the perspective of protecting water quality that the water is being flushed through relatively rapidly by the natural hydrodynamics of Casco Bay. We don't have recent modeling of water movement in Casco Bay, and that's one of our priorities right now, is to try to nail those things down. Right now, those are my best guesses, but you know, I'd like to have better science behind it.
Okay, and then Susan asks, what could be done to reduce the high fecal coliform in Falmouth?
I think the number one thing on that is almost certainly to be focusing on stormwater management and management of potential sources of fecal coliform coming off of the developed landscape. On that part of Falmouth, I doubt, and Ashley, you would know far better than I doubt there's a whole lot of places there on septic tanks, which is the other classic source for this, is septic tanks that are not working tend to be a big source of that. But on that part of the shoreline of Falmouth, I can't imagine there's a lot of them. So the likely sources are probably going to be things like wash off of bacteria off of parking lots, or places where the existing, there's an illegal cross connection between a sewer line and a stormwater line. And the cities, the towns in this region are working really hard on all of that under their so-called MS4 permit systems to try to reduce those kinds of potential sources of bacteria entering the water there. The other thing is, it's just people, dog walking, activities on the land. There's just things that get in the water, and the more people there are, the more likely somebody's dropped something that's acting as a partial source of this stuff. But there are efforts that can be taken to sort of go up each watershed and say, is that connection, is that pipe there doing what we think it is, or does it have bacteria coming out of it that it shouldn't have? Or is that stormwater pipe running when it's dry and it shouldn't be running if it's dry? If there's no storm, there shouldn't be water coming out of a stormwater drain. So there are things like that that can be done. And again, the MS4 permit programs in most of our coastal towns are working very hard to work on that stuff. And as I said at the beginning, there is nobody who deserves more of our thanks for clean water than the folks in our towns who are working on behalf of clean water. They're working hard at this stuff. So thank you, everybody, for what you do.
And I'm just going to sneak in one final question from Robert and Vicky, who say, great information. Do you have all the funding you need to do all the analyses you think are important?
So I think I said earlier, we're a staff of 4. We wrote this over 2 years. It's probably been 50% of my time over 2 years. I am the director, but I'm also our lead scientist. And so it's been a huge lift for us. The data supplied to us, we are getting from our partners, and Friends of Casco Bay is probably a third of the data I showed you comes directly from Friends of Casco Bay. We provide a little bit of funding to help them with that, but they raise most of the money to do that from private sources. So my first thought is, hey, they need more money to do this better. They're doing it better and better every year. And yes, we can use more resources for monitoring. The other place we get a lot of the data is from our state and federal agency partners. And that tends to be things where there's a legal requirement to collect the data. So there's a legal requirement to protect people from eating contaminated shellfish. So the Department of Marine Resources goes out and samples for bacteria. So there are a variety of sources like that we tap. There are many other things we would like to be measuring. We have very little data on nitrogen in the streams entering Casco Bay. We have very little data on coastal acidification from different locations around the bay. Friends of Casco Bay now is tracking that at 3 locations. Bowdoin College tracks it at 1 more, but it's a very small scattering of locations. There's always more things we collect data on, and there's always the potential for that. But ultimately, it took me 2 years to work this stuff up as it is. You give me more data, it'll just take me 3. So we're going to have to figure out how to start working that all together. The other thing that is very exciting news for us is that under the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was signed into law in the fall, we do expect to see a big increase in funding. Some of that will likely go towards monitoring. Some of it will probably go towards the hydrodynamic modeling I just mentioned. We are still working out exactly what we're going to spend some of those resources on.
Well, that is all amazing. Thank you so much to Dr. Bohlen for speaking to us tonight. Thank you to our attendees for joining us for this presentation, and thank you to the rest of our panelists. If you have any follow-up questions, go ahead and email reference@falmouthmemoriallibrary.org. It's where you got your attendee link from, and I'll go ahead and make sure that those questions get sent to the right individual. So without further ado, thank you so much, everybody, and have a great evening.
Well, thank you, Curtis.